So, hello, back on track on the early Middle Ages, and today I want to address a topic that is really one of those topics that everybody know about and hears about since primary school in history. That is the partition of the Carolingian Empire. I already think it's gonna be a very long video because I have enough time and I want to touch various issues related to this topic and more generally to deepen a bit the awareness towards the ethnic and geographical and political divisions of the partition of Carolingian Europe. For many reasons. First of all, because this is a period of important definition of modern European identities on a regional or even proto-national base. And secondly, also because there is another logics to the partition of the Carolingian Empire that is really instead contingent to the political needs and political situation of the time, not only in the Carolingian Empire but also abroad. First of all, I would like to start remembering an aspect of the Carolingian Empire that is the substantially Germanic character of it. Meaning what? That it wasn't multi-ethnical, that it was just a Germanic thing. No, not really, but we can really say that the Carolingian Empire had in a certain sense broadly unified a very big part of Central European identity that was prevalently Germanic. You have to think at the definitive incorporation of the Bavars within the empire that had been at the time of Charlemagne, that had been this duchy that the Bavarians really never had a real kingdom on their own. It's very even difficult. First of all, even their ethnogenesis is not really very clear from an historical point of view, differently from the Franks, the Longobards, and the Saxons that they all bordered the Bavars, and it seems that the Bavars and Bavaria, as as a political entity, was a sort of emanation of a Frankish. I can't say an emanation of the Frankish people because obviously there were other peoples living in Bavaria, but let's say that they had been born politically as a group under the hegemony of the Franks, and they lived since the 6th century a bit at the periphery of the Frankish empire, and therefore with the disgregation of the Merovingian power, the Bavars really remained something on their own, relatively autonomous between the Franks and the Longobards, and probably defining into that time a part of their own identity, but let's say that they were broadly at least a German entity relatively to our point now, and not just Bavaria had been included into the Carolingian Empire, but also all the Pannonia, the Pannonian plain that had that is south of the river Danube, that had been at that point up to that point inhabited by and famously by the Avars, the Avar kingdom that had been gone progressively weakening, and that eventually was taken out by Charlemagne. Another very big part of the Germanic world that was included into the Carolingian Empire is famously Saxony. So the Saxons, I mean the continental Saxons, obviously the Anglo-Saxons have nothing to do with that. But it's still interesting to think of these sort of similarities that there were among the Germanic world. The Anglo-Saxons indeed had to a moment of they were strongly influenced by the Franks since an early age, and also because they were right across the channel. So, but they obviously didn't. They were never subdued by the Carolingians. It just seems that at the beginning of the 7th century, probably under the Merovingian king Dagobert I, that sort of reunited the the Frankish kingdom. The Franks were able to exercise very strong influence on Anglo-Saxon England, but not at the point of managing to make it a part of their dominions. But it must not be too much relativized, because indeed the Anglo-Saxons at that time were rather weak, if anything, because they were fragmented, politically speaking, while the Frankish kingdom in that very moment had been very strong. Eventually it fragmented itself again, so there was a much more paritary relation between Britain and the continent. However, during the Carolingian Empire, probably the Anglo-Saxons took also a lot of, in terms of propaganda and historical, propaganda and political models from the Franks in a certain measure, even though they remained really a world on their own. Another people that was conquered and definitely subdued by the Carolingians were the Freezens. That, however, kept rebelling, and historically speaking, they would remain quite isolated, even within the same Carolingian Empire. And this had consequences for the rest of their history, meaning that even in the low Middle Ages there was a different identity in Frisia compared to other regions around of Germanic ethnicity. And therefore, especially these groups that we have quoted now were indeed they carried with them a very strong Germanic characterization, especially the Saxons. And this was very meaningful in coincidence with another point, that is that basically the Franks and the Carolingians in this time were basically the only true Germanic entity that was able to form a solid kingdom in that context, meaning that the Visigoths had been washed away by the Arabs at the beginning of the 8th century. The Longobards had been conquered by the Franks. So aside from the far north of the Danes, of the Scandinavians and the Anglo-Saxons, let's say that in continental Europe the monopolium of the continent was Carolingian indeed, and this was obviously exercised also on southern Europe, so on the Latin peoples, at least called Latin from a linguistical way, not because they had maybe a very strong ethnical glue between themselves, and obviously the greatness, the largeness of the Carolingian Empire brought the Carolingians to mix with these southern peoples and becoming one. obviously these Latin-speaking people were already heavily mixed with Germanic peoples. We have remembered the Visigoths in Spain, but also the Longobards in Italy had a quite strong, at least cultural impact in Italy, and the Franks felt even a sort of proximity to the Longobards, especially in terms of political might, and always considered within, however, an original Germanic identity that the Longobards, at least that they had originally and formally at the time of the Carolingian Empire, in spite, I mean, obviously, of the Romanization of the Langobard kingdom, but it was always the Langobard kingdom, not the kingdom of the Italics or of the Italians and stuff like that. And obviously there were, as you understand, in this very large group of peoples from Western to Central to Southern Europe, there were a lot of different shades, let's say, of a lot of different ethnicities, a lot of different languages that very often at this time were more had more a regional base than a real proto-national base. But thanks also to the Carolingians, we will be seeing that something was changing. You could argue that in France, Germany and Italy already something proto-national was taking place. We can't speak about it at length for every single entity, but let's take an example. For instance, let's talk about Frankish Austrasia, or Austrasia in Latin, as it was called. That was basically the eastern half of the Frankish, not empire, but Frankish kingdom proper. That was the original Francia, the land of the Franks. Austrasia means the land of the east, and it was the one that comprehended parts of today's lowlands and the parts of Western Germany, so areas that were quite heavily Germanic in identity, and that they had remained so in being Frankish, meaning that in Western Francia, the Franks, even though they had a consistent presence, even demographically speaking, seemingly, they had essentially Latinized. And this was a process that was an ongoing process still at that point. It took hundreds of years to obtain a true French identity eventually, and something starts from here. But relatively to Austrasia, let's say that this area was, especially the southeastern one, that we're talking about, the Middle Rhine and the River Main, it was quite deeply colonized by the Franks in Carolingian times on Thuringian and Alemannic soil, and this area was began to be called Franconia in Latin. So that is the land of the Franconians, and together with the Saxons, the Thuringians, the Alemannians, the Alemannians at this time were starting to be called Swabians, and the Bavars in the south. There was a tendency that we can, it's very progressive, but we can start observing it already from the Carolingian age, and especially during the post-Carolingian age, to build altogether sort of a big cultural community. It would be interesting to understand in which measure this was really pushed or whether it was really felt. Obviously both, but the interaction would be quite interesting to be analyzed deeply. And this very big cultural community, especially in certain cultural centers like the monastery of Fulda in the very heart of Germany, were began to call themselves German or Teutonic. So distinguishing themselves from the rest of the Germanic world, that is from those peoples that were inhabiting west of the Baltic Sea and gravitating around the North Sea. And we're talking about the Scandinavians, including the Danes, the Freezens that we have seen, and also the Anglo-Saxons. Therefore, we can see in this process the first and gradual formation of a national German identity. We can't say that. Obviously, it's a very hotly debated topic because it's very difficult to say, well, from this moment on it belongs. But let's say that the Carolingian partitions, and we will be seeing that, sort of catalyzed this process, and it's really the moment in which Germany, in this specific example, starts to take a path on its own. Then on the peripheral areas, obviously there was a lot of cultural interaction, and it's very complicated, but broadly speaking, there was first enucleation of a German national identity. And if it wasn't a national identity proper, which in fact it's very debatable, we can't say at least a tendential linguistical commonality. It's indeed, the linguistical part was indeed important in this process. And an equally lengthy formation at the same time was tendentially the one of sort of French civilization, broadly meant. That was obviously on a Frankish and Latin base, and it was pushing towards also the acquisition of other elements around that, however, were also developing identities on their own, such as Aquitaine, that even very late during the Middle Ages, even well through the modern era, sort of was a sort of national identity on its own. And indeed also Italy, and especially central and northern Italy, start to become, even earlier from this time, let's say especially from the Longobards conquest, but one can debate about it even before, to be felt not anymore just like a Celto-Italic group, but as with Germanic influences, but a sort of Italian group. In fact, the term Lombard or Longobard at that time was often used to define all the inhabitants of the Italian peninsula, especially also from peoples that were far away and tended to approximate in this sense these ethnical definitions. But it's very important because here it starts. Think even at today's European Union, you have Germany, France, Italy, and these are essentially the strong core of continental, at least Western European identity. And as I was saying before, to these new European tendencies and orientation, we must add the contribute that the great political division in which the Frankish Empire was going to articulate at the end of the age of Charlemagne, were starting to distribute, let's say, these portions of Europe to the various branches of the various members, actually, and eventually their descendants of the imperial family, of the Carolingian family. And it wasn't really a unitary process. We will arrive to the Treaty of Verdun of 843. That was the most famous one. Is the one you probably all remember from the times of school. But as you see, there were also previous divisions that eventually brought to the partitioning the at least 3 major kingdoms in Western Europe, and there was also precocious other precocious examples of actual political partition, such as the attribution of the king of the kingdom of the Lombards to a son of Charles the Great. There was Pippin, who eventually died, didn't participate to the partition eventually of Verdun in 781. As well as the attribution of the kingdom of Aquitaine. It was, if I'm not wrong, created as such only at that point with this title, to another son of Charles the Great, who was instead Ludwig. And these are all previously to Verdun, and this also makes you understand how fluid, technically speaking and practically speaking, was this partition, because it was felt like, you know, you are all of my sons. I am Charlemagne. You are all my sons, and I give you this and that. Oh wait, you need this. Okay, let's switch it. I mean, it was very fluid at the beginning, and then, as we know, at the death of Charles the Great in 814, there were a lot of struggles between the same members of the Carolingian families, of the family. Although families could be used as well, because Charles the Great had many sons for many women, and indeed. There was a lot of political playing also in this sense. For instance, it seems that for Charles the Bold, the great success of this man was also due to his mother, who was an extremely intelligent and ambitious woman who pushed for his son to obtain a space among the other half brothers that instead were preferred, apparently. And telling the truth, with Charles the Great, things were technically easier because the partitions would eventually take place within his nephews, for instance. Meaning that, and this was a luck for the Carolingian Empire, because normally the Carolingians were used indeed to split the empire or the kingdom in Carolingian times among all the various sons they had. Charlemagne had only one heir remaining at his death. That was notoriously Ludwig the First, also better known as Ludwig the Pious, who eventually had the sons who split up the Carolingian Empire. So I was wrong before by thinking about Pippin in terms of Charlemagne. He would have been the uncle of of these guys. But it were also the various biographical stories are very interesting, because, for instance, Charles the Bold basically outlived all of his brothers. So at a point he was at the end of his kingdom, he was still fighting with his nephews at that point. So it's very complex and interesting at the same time, as often in history. However, and Ludwig the Pious was a great Carolingian emperor. He was one of the tough ones. He was still one of those who had a clear understanding of the necessity of keeping the Carolingian Empire undivided in a certain measure, or at least to push for the creation of a public central authority that could balance these centrifugal forces that were eventually relieved at every time a father died and had to split to his sons, even in fact within the imperial family, and Ludwig as well, or Louis, as you want to call him, had been equally lucky, just like his father, to have had having had brothers that had eventually died when he had to rule, so they didn't have to face these problem of partitioning and sharing with their brothers the imperial rule. But even Ludwig the Pious, or Louis the Pious, had great troubles, because basically his sons began to split the empire and to fight against him in concrete wars in order to depose him. Louis the Pious, at the end of his empire, had also become blind. He objectively couldn't manage to rule the empire, and that's where the tripartition of the Carolingian Empire eventually started. We can say that probably the luckiest one of Louis the Pious' sons was Ludwig, who eventually became Ludwig II, called Ludwig the German. That from the partition that his father, when he was still alive, had got essentially Bavaria. He added through several years of war, even Alemannia, Franconia, Saxony, and Thuringia. So even before the Treaty of Verdun, after the death of Louis the Pious, Ludwig, eventually known as Ludwig the German, had managed to acquire all these big eastern portion of the Carolingian Empire that would make up essentially and very roughly today's Germany and Austria, or large parts of it. And when Louis the Pious, however, died, we find the major clash between his sons that ended with the fundamental Treaty of Verdun of 843 that recognized, for instance, to Ludwig the German the regions that he had occupied, hence all the Germanic lands east of the Rhine. And so did also the distribution of the rest of the empire to the firstborn son of Louis the Pious, who was Lothar the First. And Louis the Pious had already associated Lothar to his imperial dignity. And also the other element that was the youngest of the brothers that we already named, that was Charles the Bold. And these were essentially the only three sons that had survived Louis the Pious. So that's why there was a tripartition among them. And what did Lothar, we have seen about Ludwig the German what he got. What did Lothar and Charles the Bold got? Well, Lothar had a very long stripe of central territories, looking at the full Carolingian Empire, that basically stretched from the North Sea until the Adriatic and Tyrrhenian seas. So he basically got Frisia, the regions that was located between the Rhine and the Scheldt River, so west of the Rhine, the High Meuse River, the Saône River, and the Rhone. So a very broad area that stretched essentially in what would have become Burgundy and Provence. And probably more importantly, the whole Italic kingdom of the Franks, that was derived from the Langobard one, and which very importantly had its own juridical figure, differently from the other partitions, who were essentially hadn't been under a unique rule, and were lands that were administratively formed at that point in the Treaty of the Verdun, and that still retained its capital in Pavia. This makes you understand the importance of the Kingdom of Italy at that time, which also contained Rome, formally speaking. So it's no surprise that Lothar, as the firstborn, got this very big area that also comprehended the ancient, well, yes, of course, the Italic kingdom, but also the capital. Put 1,000 brackets to this word in this context. That was Aachen, the city that Charlemagne had founded in order to make it become a sort of second Rome, a Rome of the North. That is in today's Germany, and was at that point part of the lands of Lothar. These lands altogether were initially called Lotharingia, or Lotharingia, that basically means the lands of Lothar. And this is a name that was retained by regionally eventually by only a small part of it, that is today's Lorraine in France, which takes its name from Lothar, indeed, and was part of, obviously, of Lotharingia at that time as well. So we have seen Ludwig the German, Lothar the First. What did Charles the Bold take? Well, he got instead all the western regions, or at least, let's say better, all the regions west of Lotharingia. And so you clearly see this pattern in the picture. It's three groups, it's three elements that are more or less recalling, partly at least for the dominions of Ludwig and Charles, respectively today's Germany and France. And for Lotharingia you see a kingdom of Italy that comprehended central and northern Italy, and this stripe that goes from Provence to Frisia, in crossing Central Europe. What What really did really made this division being such? I mean, in which way really the Carolingians divided their empire in these three parts? According to which logics, really? Well, this is a big question. We can't answer it properly now, but let's say that relatively to what we were talking about at the beginning, we can say that this division didn't really stem from linguistic or national, proto-national worries. Probably the Carolingians didn't really care about it even. Also because at that time they weren't felt as such. There wasn't anything like a German or a French or an Italian national identity. It was something that was just starting at the very early stage. However, it's still very meaningful to notice how spontaneous this geographical tripartition actually took place, and how it reveals how these three areas were felt essentially as let's say at least a rational ensemble, at least from an administrative point of view. I mean, these brothers basically had split the empire in a way that presumably favored their rule over these parts. So there was a logic that really corresponded to that, and that starts to overlap also with a sort of proto-national identity. And this is very meaningful also for another aspect that I'm sure many of you remember, that is the Oath of Strasbourg. It's one of the most famous events of the early Middle Ages. It was an oath taken in fact in the city of Strasbourg in 842, so just before the Treaty of Verdun. Take Strasbourg not just a random city. Strasbourg is essentially at the crossroads between Germany, France, and Italy. Even the same name brings a Germanic and a Latin etymology, because Burg is obviously German. Strass derives from the Latin strata, that means way. And it was also a very strategical important point to cross, to go across the three countries, and the Romans had actually that city very dear. It was called Argentorate at the time, exactly because of this strategical significance in order to access the three regions. And it's a beautiful city. If you haven't ever been in Strasbourg, go there, because it's very, very beautiful. Today it's in France, in Alsace, that is also a border region. Alsace was the German Alsace that eventually was taken from the French, but still retains a very strong Germanic outlook. And that was, the French and the Germans have really a lot to tell about their fights for Alsace. And going back to the oath, what you find in this was what oath was that? It was the oath that was pronounced by Ludwig the German and Charles the Bold. So these two brothers, that in that moment, during these extremely ferocious and extremely bloody and extremely destructive wars, were allied against Lothar, so their older brother, and they sworn this oath, very importantly, in front of their respective armies that had been recruited in the two different partitions that had already settled at the time. And the very meaningful thing of the Oath of Strasbourg is that these two parts had put a great care that both kings were understood in their oath by their respective armies, so that evidently spoke two different languages. And the beautiful thing, and the Oath of Strasbourg is still present. It's one of the most important in historical witnesses of the in linguistical history, in the history of German and of French, of the French languages, because Ludwig sworn publicly in a Romance language, so in ancient French, while Charles sworn in a Germanic language, so that they could be respectively understood by their brothers' armies that evidently already spoke at the time between East and West two different languages that would have evolved eventually into Germany, into German and French, East and West. And it's very fascinating, even very moving in a certain way, to think at those days, at those moments, and at how these European identities that eventually were more sharply shaped especially by conflict, by war, but also obviously by contacts, by trades, or were already beginning at that time, and even before the Carolingian times. And I find it also very fascinating how the Carolingian Empire was able eventually even to think that there could be a coexistence of these elements on the long run. Eventually it failed because the Carolingian Empire failed in itself, but it didn't fail because of these differences. Why the Carolingian Empire failed in the end will be the topic of another really lengthy video, such as this one, or even more in the future. But we can say that much of our European identity was formed really back in that time, that the Carolingian Empire and lands that were occupied by it really retain, it can really be understood as a core of much of Western European identity that eventually flowed also into other regions, and especially through feudalism, but also through the means of a common scholastic education. Remember that when we are talking about vernaculars as the ones we made reference to today, so German, French, etc., this was an empire that really worked publicly, at least, and formally, especially in the north, through Latin. So a language that wasn't really spoken anymore, nor in France, obviously not in Germany, where it had never been spoken, and at this point not even in Italy, because in Italy we already find a language that at this time is different, and that will evolve probably a bit later than the others as a vernacular proper with its own literary dignity, but immediately much higher as a language, much more developed eventually at the beginning of the 13th century, while German and French are a bit come a bit earlier. but also because they were simpler languages, and also because they hadn't to struggle with a more alphabetized environment such as the Italian one was, in which, you know, through scholastic education, more or less, you understood Latin and you could use it more easily in public administration. The Longobards, so even previously to the Carolingian conquest, wrote and, you know, discussed and their, for instance, the trials in public occasions in Latin, or at least there was a juridical language that was Latin, clearly. While in Germany, people first of all didn't write down things; that they started to do so only after the Carolingian conquest. But it was much of an oral tradition, and they only used German, obviously. In France it was a bit more complicated because, especially in northern France, there was a much more similar tradition to Germany in this sense, and there are striking similarities between the laws of the Franks and one of the Saxons. But at the same time, in France there was a very strong episcopal structure and influence, and eventually through the Carolingian Empire there was a very strong push for a Latinization of you know, of the public administration. So things really changed, and that's the moment in which you understand that the Carolingian Empire had a much broader ambition, that they used Latin because they wanted to speak to all the peoples that were in Europe at the time, and Latin was the best mean to do that. And this is something that survived to the Carolingian Empire. One of the few very important things, I must say, that survived from the Carolingian Empire. And concluding really on this tripartition, it's a phenomenon that you really have to study, interestingly, from political and also ethnical point of view, because the differences within the Carolingian Empire were meaningful indeed, and they eventually shaped European history as such. Fine, so I'm sorry, at a certain point I always get in a sort of boring sound fashion, because I start mumbling on my own, but I hope that the whole concepts were clear. If you enjoyed this video, please share it or like it, or subscribe to my channel, or all three things. If you want to comment, obviously you're welcome, and I remember you that if you want me to give an explanation about what I said, which would be really the case, because, you know, these are very complex topics, please ask, and I can even make a video for you, because this is really the beginning of this channel. I don't know how it will go, that depends on you. Well, it depends also on me to entertain you, obviously, but a very good way to get it started is to share my videos and to ask me for other dedicated videos. That is a way to put things in motion, to create a debate, and I think it's very interesting for all us involved. So I thank you for listening. If you had the patience to listen to all of it, my compliments, you're a hero. For my bad English, I'm sorry as well, and I wish you a very good time, and see you in the next one. Bye.